I think there's also a media piece. Amy Goodman, Democracy Now!, The Nation, we try to cover what's happening in left communities, in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and obviously in this country. But I think too often, as I said, we are told that our ideas, which are humane, common sense ideas, are not possible. But when you look out at the world, they are. And part of it, at the root of it, I'll stop, is the establishments everywhere have failed. What comes next is our struggle, because the old order is disappearing or is dying. The new one is not yet born. And in that moment, we are fighting and we are ascendant. We're seeing possibilities crop up, not just out of the blue, but because of years of organizing, people coming to these ideas, and despite a mainstream media. But at The Nation, Democracy Now!, we report on what is underreported or unreported, what's going on in cities rising across this country. We talked about the mayor, Lumumba. People need to know about Larry Krasner or Christine Pellegrino or the candidates who are winning down ballot. My colleague John Nichols, next issue, a big piece on that. If people don't know, you will mobilize, but not mobilize with as much strength or knowledge as leads to a stronger victory.
I wanted to talk about a very definite place and what has come out of that and transformed this past year. Yesterday, I was deeply moved watching and listening to Dallas Goldtooth, and this morning to Mark Tilson. I want to talk about the standoff at Standing Rock. And yesterday morning, I was just interviewing, we'll play this next week, the Standing Rock Sioux chairman, Dave Archambault. And it started last April 1st, of course, long before that, but this chapter of the struggle. LaDonna Brave Bullallard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota, opened her property along the Cannonball River to the resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, that would snake its way from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, taking fracked oil through North Dakota, South Dakota, Indiana, Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. The Native Americans call it the Black Snake. And the organizing that took place there, and counterpose that to what was happening last year. And it was then, but it was then that the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed the dogs on the Native Americans, attack dogs. And we were filming, we were interviewing people who were bleeding from bite wounds, who had just been maced by the guards as well. Even showed dogs, they would be thrown into the crowd. They would back off, the dogs, and the guards would throw them into crowd. They would bite their way out. We showed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Even though they don't call themselves protesters, they call themselves water protectors. The water protectors were injured, they were wounded. They prevailed that day. They forced the guards and the bulldozers back. We interviewed Winona LaDuke that day. She said, at the time it was Governor Dalrymple of North Dakota, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1965. We are through. And so we posted the video online that night on Facebook. There were 14 million views in about 48 hours, giving the lie to the corporate media that would say people just aren't interested in this issue. It is our job to show the images. It is our job to go to where the silence is. And in fact, it's not that quiet. In fact, people are organizing everywhere. And so we came back to New York, continued to cover this story, and on Thursday night before the judge ruled, the governor called out the National Guard. It didn't look good for the tribe. The judge would rule the next day. Also quietly, the authorities issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know that at the time. The next day, on Friday, the judge ruled against the tribe, but 15 minutes later, the Obama administration issued a 3-agency letter, Interior, Justice, and the Army Corps of Engineers, saying they were going to slow down the process, see if Native Americans were included, see if there was an environmental impact statement, which gave some strength to, some sense of success to the Native Americans who were fighting this. We had gone to Canada that day. We weren't fleeing, Nermeen Sheikh and I, but we were invited to the Toronto International Film Festival for a great new film out on the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone, and we were invited to speak afterwards. They were showing from I.F. Stone to Democracy Now! To Rolling Stone. Matt Taibbi came up. And the next day, we were speaking at the University of Toronto, and I got this text on my phone as I was speaking, and it said, "You're under arrest." And I didn't understand. I thought it was some kind of scam, it said, "There's an arrest warrant for you," except that I saw it was a North Dakota number. So the first job was to get back into the United States before the arrest warrant went into the system, because you're not immediately arrested, but if you have an interaction with FBI, police, or border guards, you could be in trouble. I made it back. I didn't take this arrest warrant seriously. I mean, personally, I took it very seriously, but not personally, because I felt it was a message to journalists all over our country: do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we had to be there. And I also thought it was critical for young journalists to not feel that if they go somewhere to cover an epic struggle like this, that they would end up in jail. This is America. You should not have to get a record when you put things on the record. And so we returned to North Dakota a few weeks later. The same team, Democracy Now!'s John Hamilton and Laura Gottesdiener and my colleague Dennis Moynihan, who's here, to challenge the warrant. And as we landed in Bismarck, North Dakota, the authorities announced they were dropping the charges, but they'd bring more serious ones. They'd charge me with riot. I could face a year in jail. I was a one-woman riot? What were they talking about? This was a level of harassment that we had to continue to challenge. But they said I'd be arraigned on Monday. This was a Friday afternoon, which gave us 2 more days to cover the protests, which again were quite remarkable and fierce and peaceful. Because the show must go on Monday morning, we broadcast in front of the Vanden courthouse and jail, with the 10 Commandments in between. And we interviewed the Standing Rock Sioux chairman, Dave Archambault. I said, "Have you ever been arrested?" By the way, he just went to trial last week and was acquitted. But he said yes, and he got a low-level misdemeanor charge. And I said, "So what happened?" And he said, "I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed." We interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, who's the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, who cares about the children's health. She was one of the first to be arrested. I said, "What happened?" She said, "I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed." How much humiliation can a people take? At that point, hundreds of Native Americans had been arrested, and they're put in the Vanden jail. The people of Vanden and Bismarck had already said no to the pipeline, and their wishes were respected. The Standing Rock Sioux were just saying, "Treat us like any North Dakotan," but they weren't so lucky. And so at the end of the show, I would have to be arraigned. Hundreds of Native Americans and allies came to show their support. Now, the world's media was covering this. A journalist was being arraigned. The New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Nation, homepage of the BBC, Al Jazeera, Vogue magazine was covering this. I have to spiff up my act. And then, right before the arraignment, the judge announced that he would not be signing off on the charges for that arraignment. But more important, a number of Native Americans who were facing felony and misdemeanor charges that day had their charges dropped. It really shows when the media spotlight shines in the right direction, what a difference it can make. And we have to redirect that media spotlight, build our own media, and challenge the corporate media. They have a responsibility as well. If they don't live up to their obligation, they're using the public airwaves, they should have their licenses revoked.
Thank you. Now we're talking, we originally started with international leaders, and I'm really pleased that you brought up Standing Rock, sovereign nations within our borders that we need to treat much better and really need to partner with much more. That's a fabulous story. I want to hear more. Naomi, did you want to add something in terms of international leaders, or do you want to broaden it to talk about leadership in general? What do we need from our leaders? How are we choosing them? Is it the right way? Shouldn't the mission lead instead of the individual celebrity?
Sure, yeah. Well, this is a moment, and it is global, right? What happened in the United States with the Sanders campaign, what just happened in the UK with this complete upset, all of the pundit class, this supposed consensus that the result of the UK election would be an overwhelming mandate for the Tories and a complete wipeout of Jeremy Corbyn, because he was supposedly unelectable because his ideas were too radical, because he did not represent these focused group opinions. He had actually taken positions out of passion and belief. Imagine that. And also because he wasn't a traditional, and isn't a traditional kind of slick, charismatic politician. So the assumption was, of course, he would just be decimated. And this was proven completely wrong. Another example of this is the surge of Podemos in Spain and taking power, not Podemos officially, but mayoral candidates and municipal movements associated with Podemos in Madrid, in Barcelona, linked directly to social movements. And then in France, another upset with Jean-Luc Mélenchon running on a very radical, progressive left platform, coming within 2 points of bumping Marine Le Pen, the fascist Marine Le Pen, off of the second ballot. Once again, against all the predictions of the pundit class, having rallies of 70,000 people. So the issue is the passion that is being provoked here. And it is the passion not of no, but the passion of yes, of putting positive, transformative ideas on the table. Because the real success of the neoliberal project that we have all been living for 4 decades, right, was never really to convince us that their cruel ideas of privatization and deregulation and tax cuts for the rich, paid for by savaging the public sphere that serves people while massively increasing the structures of incarceration and militarization and war, that these were good ideas, that these were right ideas. That was not the triumph of neoliberalism. A real triumph of neoliberalism was convincing us that our ideas were impossible. So as we have slowly been getting our confidence up, right, the first stage was getting the courage up to say no, enough, right? And we heard that no ricochet around the world after 2008, when the neoliberals broke their own rules in plain view of the world and intervened dramatically in the market, right? Forget trickle down. Suddenly there are trillions of dollars to intervene in the market and save people if they are rich enough, right? To save the banks from their own greed. And we all saw it, right? So the spell of neoliberalism broke and people had the courage to say no, to reject, right? But that wasn't enough. Where we really see the momentum is in the next wave, is in these political configurations, sometimes new parties, insurgents, candidacies coming forward and breaking the real spell, because now we're seeing that we were lied to, that progressive ideas are popular, that radical ideas are popular, right? Like universal public health care, like free public education for all, like erasing debt for students, like getting to 100% renewable energy in 2 decades as quickly as technology allows and science demands, right? So the intellectual fencing of neoliberalism that has constrained our imagination for 4 decades is lying crumbled on the ground. Anything is possible now, right? What's next? Reparations for slavery and colonialism? Worker co-ops as the centerpiece of a democratic economy? Who knows? Let's put our ideas on the table, because we were lied to, and these ideas are popular, and it is urgent. Because it's not just our ideas that are popular, that are surging in this vacuum created by the collapse of the neoliberal intellectual project. It is also fascist ideas that are surging. It is also white supremacist ideas that are surging. It is also climate change denying ideas that are surging. We are in a race against time, right? We have found out in these almost wins that we can win. And if we can win, we must win. We have a moral responsibility to win, right? Because our losses are measured in lives. Our losses are measured in entire countries disappearing beneath the waves. We don't get a do-over on a drowned country, right? We live in this fearsome moment, in this race against time, between these incredibly dangerous ideas, but also the other players in this race are the Earth's atmosphere, the acidifying oceans, our eroding soil. So now that we know we can win, we have to win. And the courage of this moment has to involve self-criticism on our part. We are getting closer, but we are not yet winning. Why? Why? We can't just blame others. We can't just say we would have won if we hadn't have been and this hadn't have happened. No. Just like those corporate Democrats can't blame Russia, we can't just blame the corporate Democrats, okay? We also have to admit that the coalitions that have been built on the left have been too white, that too often race and gender and sexuality have felt like an add-on to too many people. We need to build this right from day one. The progressive majority is within reach, but we have to build the tent right from day one, and that is leadership. And as we heard last night, as we heard this morning, it means taking leadership from the people who are most impacted, most ravaged by this system. We're seeing the leadership in this room. Now, I don't think this movement knows exactly what the next stage is, so this is a complicated moment, right? We don't know what exactly the strategy is. Is it in or out, right? And who is it? And we have all these questions. I don't have the answers. But what I know is that we can't wait, and that the leadership, I believe, should come in the form of people's platforms, that we need to get together and we need to lay out our yes. And it needs to be inspiring. We need to plant those tent posts of this broad progressive coalition so that whatever the next political configuration is, if it's inside the Democratic Party, if it's outside, if it's both, okay? If whoever the leaders are, we don't know who the leaders are going to be, but that those leaders are held accountable to the movement leaders and the vision that emerges dramatically, democratically, from below. We don't have to wait for saviors to come along and figure this out, because the brilliance is in this room, the brilliance is in the movements, and we need to tell this connective story that says, we're not going to play my crisis is bigger than your crisis. We are going to come up with deeply integrated intersectional solutions that radically bring down emissions while fighting gender and racial inequality and economic inequality. It is possible. The policies are there. The principles have to be front lines first. That means that as we switch from fossil fuels to renewables, renewables should be democratically owned and controlled, and it should be the communities that were most poisoned that are first in line to own and control their own renewable energy projects as a drop in the oceans of reparations for colonialism and slavery, and on and on. Thanks. Thank you.
Danny,
I think when I spoke about movements, certainly the movements of the 20th century, and we can talk about the list of names from Eugene Debs to Emma Goldman to Ida B. Wells, who led an anti-lynching campaign at the end of the 19th century. And those movements that have happened, the anti-apartheid movement, let us not forget what happened in Latin America over the last 20 years. An extraordinary change happened in Latin America, in a sense. And often that change was demonized by the corporate press. Places like Democracy Now! And The Nation, everything, were able to report accurately on what's happening in Latin America. Extraordinary things happened. Latin America, where every country had a military dictatorship, and that military dictatorship was overthrown in some way and led to a new democracy. So you had grassroots democracy happening in those particular countries. You can say Venezuela, you can say Brazil, where the Workers' Party in Brazil elevated the life of men and women in Brazil. We've seen examples of that. And yet at the same moment, they were in some sense undermined, and we have to be careful about that. So we have to learn our lessons from everywhere and be careful about that. I'm going to read something from W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois published an important book in 1903, The Souls of Black Folks. W.B. Du Bois, one of the founders, along with Ida B. Wells, a journalist, a feminist, a radical, were the founders of the NAACP. And he said at the beginning of the 20th century, the question of the 20th century is the question of the color line. And I'm going to read his quotes on the 50th anniversary of the release of the Souls of Black Folks in 1953. He says, I still today, as yesterday, I still think today as yesterday that the color line is the great problem of this century. But today I see more clearly than yesterday that back of the problem of race and color lies a greater problem which both obscures and implements it, and that is the fact that so many civilized persons are willing to live in comfort even if the price of this is poverty, ignorance, and disease of the majority of their fellow men. That to maintain this privilege, men have waged war until today war tends to become universal, continuous, and the excuse for this war continues largely to be color and race. That's real. King talked about it when he said militarism, racism, and materialism. And I think we can't lose sight of that. The question of democracy, the test case of democracy in this country lies around the whole issue of race, period. It always has, it always will be.
I wanted to pick up on something Danny just said, because I was at Riverside Church in April of this year. It was the 50th anniversary of King's speech against the Vietnam War, and I think many of you know that the civil rights community, the establishment, just savaged him for saying that you needed to unite in the fight against militarism, materialism, racism. Reverend Barber, great organizer, Moral Mondays, spoke that day. And I just want to raise, in a spirit of humility, I was struck at this great gathering, there isn't more about war and peace. I think we need to really lay out, again, not just what is imperiled, but what we stand for. And there's a vacuum. America's policing the world. There are bases ringing the world. There's a reflexive interventionism. And there's a crazy military budget, which loots the possibility of rebuilding our country. So I just think we would be wise to think hard about what we could do to rebuild. Senator Sanders spoke well about the dangers of regime change as foreign policy. He spoke about the Middle East. But I think this country may not be anti-war, but it is weary of war. It is weary of war without end, endless war. And if there is a through line in the nation's history, it is that empire, military misadventures abroad are toxic for democracy at home. Two last small things. This panel is from knowledge to action. And many of you are educators in your own way, and we were talking last night. Our editorial board member, Eric Foner, great historian of Reconstruction, of slavery, of the Civil War, supported Bernie Sanders. But he wrote me one day and he said, if you have any tie to Senator Sanders, can you tell him, enough with Denmark? How about retrieving our own country's radical tradition? And I think it's important as we think of all the young people, we haven't mentioned young people, who have supported Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, our future, and the next generation, what will they learn? Our history textbooks are homogenized. We need to lay out, it's about Tom Paine, it's about the abolitionists, Ida B. Wells, it's about the populists and the populist platform of 1892, which speaks to a country very similar to ours. It's about Roosevelt and this economic Bill of Rights, that health care is a right, housing is a right, education is a right. It's about Eugene Debs, 1 million votes, and into this moment. So I think to retrieve that history says to those, it's impossible. No, it isn't. We've lived through times like this, and we have seized them. And finally, just a shout out to the progressive, don't love the word infrastructure. If you can come up with a better, less, it's so unsexy. But progressive infrastructure, which is building these victories we're talking about. People's Action, Working Families Party, Progressive Democrats of America, DFA. People on the ground putting their bodies on the line in the trenches, because it's not easy. It's not easy, but I think we're seeing people gathered, and as Naomi said so eloquently, we're close. We're moving. We're in motion. And when people are in motion, they get worried. And I think some fear is not the worst thing. And fear not just for the Trumpists, but for Democrats in name only. We need to build a progressive future, a left future. Thank you.
Add anything about historical context?
The idea of resistance, and certainly resistance to power, the idea of resistance in itself the definition is to push back. But within the course of that resistance, where do we find the new narrative of transformation? That's our question. That's our, where do we build the new communities, the ideas, the new communities of love? Where do we build that beloved community that King talked about? So what are we looking at? Resistance is one stage on the road to transformation. Always think about that.
Now we're running out of time. We had a pretty freewheeling conversation, but I think we covered a lot of what we talked about doing. This is just beginning, though. We need to have a lot more conversations like this. What I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists to give us any closing thoughts.